Call this meeting to order. This is the 32nd meeting of the Defense Committee. And we have joining us today is Mr. Fadden, former National Security Advisor, Deputy Minister of National Defense, and Director of Canadian Security and Intelligence Service, and many, many other hats. Welcome to the committee once again, and thank you for sharing your time with us. Just before I ask Mr. Fadden for his 5-minute opening statement, just bring to the attention of members that the Conference of Defense Associations has a Canada's Submarine Capability series for November 22nd, which may be of interest to some members of the committee, and I'll just bring that to your attention. Sorry, November 22nd. Okay, with that, I will call on Mr. Fadden for his opening statement, and then we'll go to our round of questioning. So, Mr. Fadden, you're on.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. I understand I'm one of your first non-Zoom witnesses for a while.
Yes.
And if you're as sick as Zoom as I am, I'm particularly pleased to be here. So I'm going to base my remarks on my experience as the Deputy at Defense, but also as somebody who's had some involvement in emergency planning and in the machinery of government, because I think that's relevant to your order of reference. I want to start by making a couple of relatively general comments, which I think should form part of your deliberations. The first one deals with time. I believe that the past practice of the CF in assisting in domestic disasters after the war, during the Cold War, afterwards, should be let aside. These practices may or may not have been appropriate for the time, but the environment today is different. And I think you must consider both the domestic environment, which you're mandated to do, but also the international environment, because both will have an impact on what the Canadian forces can and can't do. I think there's virtual unanimity today, think tanks, governments, everybody else, that crises and disasters will occur more frequently in the future than they have in the past. I think you have to accept this as a given. The last 4 or 5 years have demonstrated this in spades. So what does that mean in practical terms? I think is something that we have to talk about. I want to be clear that I'm talking about both natural disasters in Canada, but also geopolitical disasters and natural disasters around the world. The three of them are relevant, I think, to what the Canadian forces could and should do in the context of your review. If I can make a machinery of government point, the Canadian forces are a specialized and closed organization. That's not a negative comment, it's a reflection of reality. Boys and girls join at the bottom and they stay until they go at the top. It's a relatively specialized organization. They have their own culture. One of the important things I believe about organizations like that is unity of function. Asking the Canadian Forces, for example, to run a railway would be a mistake. Asking the Canadian Forces to become overly involved in disaster assistance, in my view, is also a mistake, both because it affects the culture, but also because, as you know better than I do, or as well as I do, it affects their capabilities in an operational sense. So unity of purpose, I would argue, of function is very, very important. So adding more natural disaster assistance or confirming it, I think, is at least problematic. The idea of formally adding this kind of responsibility or of creating an appendage to the CF to do this, I saw a press release the other day, a press conference, where I think it was the CDS saying that one of the things is under consideration is another sort of organization attached to the defense portfolio that would do this sort of thing. I think this would be a significant mistake. The Canadian forces right now are under all sorts of pressures. They're not doing as well as they can. Adding another function, another organization in the portfolio, I think would be a real mistake. This is not to say that I don't think that the Canadian forces shouldn't be the tool of last resort. The issue is we're defining last rather loosely. I was saying, I think, to the chair before you convened us, that it is becoming too easy for prime ministers, not in particular this one, but prime ministers generally, to simply say, I'm going to send in the army. And we do this without talking to the provinces, municipalities, and civil society about what they could and should do. And I'll come back to this, I think, in a minute. Having said all of this, what can the Canadian Forces do in dealing with disasters? I think logically and intellectually you have to divide this into three real components: logistical support, administrative support, and manpower. Manpower being the most immediate draw these days. This is a really large country, and moving supplies, emergency supplies across the country is something that the Canadian Forces can do. But even if they can do it in the context of disasters, using attacked helicopters to move bedding supplies across the country is not the best possible use of that very specialized resource. You have to do it in the absence of another capability, and that's something I want to stress. We probably in this country right now don't have another tool. I think this is really problematic for a sophisticated, complex government like the Government of Canada today. When a disaster occurs, the only thing that is available to the Prime Minister, and I want to repeat again, this is not a partisan comment. I would say the same thing under Mr. Harper or Mr. anybody else. If a Prime Minister only has one tool in the context of dealing with disasters, it's a problem, because I profoundly believe we're going to have more of these issues over the course of the last little while. So in looking at your order of reference, it occurs to me that it's very difficult for you to deal with this holistically in the absence of knowing what Canada's broader emergency capabilities and plans are. How can you advise the government, or how can you advise the House on what the CF should do in the context of disasters if the country doesn't know what the provinces have available to them? If you don't know what municipalities, what availability they have to them? I was saying to the chair before the meeting, just before I came in, I was listening to the news, and the Premier of Nova Scotia was very politely sort of rapping the federal government on the knuckles for not making 1,000 troops available right now in Nova Scotia, and I think he has 400. I mean, to my mind, that should give rise to really serious consideration about the relationship between the responsibilities of the provinces and the federal government. To use the vernacular, I ain't arguing against using the Canadian Forces as a tool of last resort, but it's becoming far too easy to make use of them. So I think you need a general review of emergency capabilities in this country. It's something that we should have done 10, 15 years ago. Again, it's not a partisan comment. Governments move on after disasters, and they don't often take the time to deal with these sorts of reviews. At a minimum, if you can't get such a general review, careful consideration, I think, should be given to the impact of increased Canadian Forces disaster assistance on its operational capabilities. I am not a military person, but I don't think you need to be, the chief of the defense staff or the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs to realize that there's not enough operational training. There are not enough exercises right now. It is short of criminal to send our troops into potentially harm's way if they're not as trained as we can possibly make them. I don't think they're doing enough today. And if they're chopping wood, which they may well need to do, and do other things to fight forest fires and whatnot, they're not doing operational training. And if many of us who believe that the geopolitical environment in the world is going to get worse are correct, these troops are going to have to be used internationally. I'm not saying there's going to be a world war, but we already have a considerable number of people in Latvia. We have troops hither and yon across the world. They are susceptible of being attacked. They need to be trained. They need to be exercised. And if we don't look at all of this in the context of disaster planning, I think it will be a mistake. So I mentioned that it's sometimes too easy for prime ministers to say we're sending in the troops. I think that's true. I've noticed recently that when the Prime Minister have made these kinds of announcements, he said, I'm going to send in the troops and the Canadian Red Cross. So it seems to me that somebody somewhere needs to look at what the Canadian Red Cross and other civil society organizations can do or should do in the context of disaster relief to relieve the Canadian Forces from having to do what they're doing today. Lastly, I think every policy file in this country has a federal-provincial component. This one is no exception. The principle here is that municipalities, then provinces, then the federal government involve themselves in disasters. There is not enough coordination, there's not enough understanding, and it's too uneven as between the provinces as what can be done. So in summary, I think you should take into account the median, domestic and international environment. Look for as much unity of function as you can with the Canadian Forces. Break down CF assistance into manpower, admin, and logistic. Look at how this fits into the Government of Canada's broader emergency planning capabilities and the desirability, and look at the desirability of a national review of emergency planning, of which the assistance of the Canadian Forces in disasters is but a relatively small component. And if we don't know what is available or what can be made available, it's not reasonable to ask the Canadian Forces to train or not train for this function. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Fadden, for your always insightful and articulate views. I believe very helpful to the committee. And if there has to be an argument about the need for operational training, we only need to look at Ukraine. The reason that the Ukrainians are putting up such a terrific fight is that Canada, over the last number of years, has trained those soldiers in so that they are really, really good soldiers now. So we need to apply the same logic to our own people. So with that, we'll go to our 6-minute round, and Ms. Gallant, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fadden, to the best of your knowledge, does Canada have an actual playbook or a plan to coordinate an immediate response when a national disaster, be it aggression from a belligerent or a natural disaster, do they possess one?
I don't think they possess a holistic one. There are sub-plans, both for national disasters and for public safety disasters and public security disasters. I don't believe there's a holistic one. There's a comprehensive one, and that's one of the things I believe is missing.
Okay, because after 9/11, I thought that was what they were trying to pull together and almost mirror the United States with their homeland security and our public safety. Do you perceive that there's an actual military threat to Canada? Does one exist?
It depends, I guess, how you define military threat. I think there is a threat from activity of Russia in the north. Not that they're going to send tanks over the polar ice cap, but simply increase Russian presence, possibly under the ice cap. I think we need to worry about this sort of thing. But we have 3 oceans in the United States. I think we need to be practical. The chances that we're going to be invaded are pretty slim.
Okay. To the best of your knowledge, does the government as a whole or even individual departments rehearse a disaster response?
In my experience, irregularly.
Tabletop exercises?
It happens, absolutely. I don't think there are enough national ones. There are not enough federal ones in the sense that combine all of the provinces. D&D definitely does. I mean, they do. I think public safety does. I believe the Mounties do. Do they have a consolidated federal one often enough? In my experience, they did not. Are there enough national ones involving the federal government and the provinces and the large municipalities? I think that virtually never happens.
Did that happen when we had an emergency preparedness college formally in place, training municipalities and various agencies thereof?
I think it helped at the medium to lower levels. It didn't really have an impact on the higher levels, but it did provide the municipalities and some of the provinces with better trained people. And I think it's a bit of a shame that we don't continue doing that.
Okay, so when 9/11 hit, was a government-coordinated disaster response executed?
It's a difficult question to answer because initially we were pretty preoccupied with dealing with the reality on the ground, and that was the case for some time. And I do think that there were a number of reviews that took place within departments and between departments. So I think the short answer is yes. My preoccupation, if I can say, is that we don't pull them together as well as we should, all of them. And they have to be kept evergreen. There's no such thing as a national disaster plan that's good for 10 years. They need to be updated yearly or every couple of years. And I want to be clear, I'm not being partisan here. I think all governments become preoccupied with the problem of the day. And you need somebody to be set aside at the ministerial level and at the public service level and to sort of say, you got to worry about emergency planning, not about what's worried today. And all governments find this hard to do because there are plenty of problems for today. I believe if we don't do more of this, we're going to regret it, given the environment that I talked about.
What about about when SARS hit? Now, mind you, that's the purview of the province to respond to something like that. But was there a more coordinated effort in place, or was it even needed at the federal level?
I think there was. I think the Department of Health actually galvanized itself relatively well, and it did deal with the provinces fairly effectively. And afterwards, they did start a policy planning process to try and be better prepared in the event that we have epidemics of that sort. So that was, to some degree, I think, the first, what's the expression, awakening call on the non-public security and non-national disaster side. And I think some progress has been made there.
Okay. Does Canada have an effective early warning system in place to detect threats by land, air, sea, space, cyber incursions and on our territory, and the ability to know soon enough to be able to protect our populations?
Chairman, if you're willing to extend this session for about 3 or 4 hours, I can answer the. It's a very tough question, ma'am. You know, we use NORAD for air and maritime incursions, and I think it's as good as they have for the United States. I think on cyber incursions, like most countries on the planet, we could do far, far better. And I think in particular that governments need to collaborate much, much more with the private sector and civil society, because the attacks today, unlike during the Cold War, are directed not only at government, but at the private sector and civil society. Is progress being made? I think so, but it's pretty slow.
Having been a public servant for Canada since the 70s, you will have seen trends. So you saw the steady attrition after Lars was closed in the military. So we were going down towards 60, and I understand that the goal was down to get to 40,000 troops. Then 9/11 happened, and all that changed. Well, right now, we have a recruitment crisis going on, and the people who are in the military, as soon as they're done, whatever their contract is, they want out. They can't deal with this wokeism in the military, and the deployments for some domestically are tedious and not what they signed up to do.
Okay.
So.
Unfortunately, you're out of time. I know you were just kind of getting wound up there, but it was unfortunate. I'm sure it's an important question. I can't extend it 3 or 4 hours without unanimous consent, which may be helpful to respond to Ms. Gallant's question. But Ms. O'Connell, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for your testimony here today. It was actually incredibly helpful. I actually asked, I think in our last meeting, the Major General that question around does he have line of sight, or is there someone within CAF that understands what are the capabilities of provinces, territories? You mentioned municipalities. I didn't even go there, but certainly that would be a big factor. And I can also appreciate that in his role, looking at what provinces and territories are doing, you know, he's dealing with the crisis on the ground in the current situation. That probably isn't at the forefront of his thinking. But I also wonder, and I wonder if you have any insight into this, or is it part of what you think this emergency capability, review of emergency capability should be? I also wonder if that definition of last resort is getting kind of stretched further and further. Are we seeing provinces and territories just not increasing capabilities because the expertise is there, when they call on it, it's there? Do you have any commentary on that, or is that part of the review that we should look at?
Well, I certainly think that a review would be useful, very useful. You know, you will know as well or better than I do that one of the challenges in government is making choices. And governments over the course of the last little while, I think, without a shadow of a doubt, have cut back on their operational capabilities, including the provinces. They've all cut back because they don't have enough money. And they don't have enough money to spend on this sort of thing because it's not happening now. It's the point I was trying to make. Every single province, if I remember correctly, has an emergency management capability or coordinating function. But coordinating function and real operational capability are two different things. You know, I think Ontario and Quebec have rather more than some of the smaller provinces. But do the federal government and the provinces talk periodically about this? Yes, they do. But I would wager you a good lunch that nobody in the federal government like now could give you a comprehensive compilation of the capabilities across the country. It's not true today, and it wasn't true 10, 15 years ago. When there's a crisis, I think generally speaking, we're very good at ratcheting ourselves up. We really are comprehensively. But as soon as the crisis goes away, it's stopped. And does DND have relationships, or the Canadian Forces have relationship with some of the provinces of what they can and can't do? Sure they do. But if there's not much there to begin with, it's a problem.
You mentioned that you didn't suggest that these capabilities just become kind of another department of CAF. Do you have an idea of the type of direction then, or is it some sort of national organization of provinces and territories? But I would think there has to be that federal component, and as you said, there are lots of expertise within CAF. So if it's not a department within CAF, do you have an idea of what then?
I certainly agree with you that there needs to be a capability within CAF. The question is how big and what. I think one of the issues that arises, and if I recall correctly, your next witness is from the Canadian Red Cross. And as I said, increasingly the PM is saying I'm sending in the Army and the Red Cross. So I think one of the questions that needs to be asked is, what can civil society provide in disasters? Can they provide, hundreds and hundreds of bodies? No, they can't. Can they provide the sort of things that the Red Cross and other organizations provide better than the military? Probably. So to my mind, it's a question of somebody somewhere looking at the federal capability, provincial capability, and civil society as well. Some people argue that we should go the route of the United States with FEMA, which actually has operational capability for disasters. A lot of Americans would tell you that it's not the success story that some people think.
Do I have time? Okay, thank you. Last question. I'm not sure, just based on your bio, the timing, so correct me if I'm wrong, if you were still advising during Operation Provision in the settling of Syrian refugees, and I was just curious about your experience, if there's any commentary here about there was a decision or to have lodging of refugees in CAF bases, and you talked about unity of purpose, and I was just curious what that sort of operational change, what that experience might have been, if you have any commentary on that.
Yeah, I was still there at the beginning, and there were a number of plans put forward. One of them was to bring people in and put them in CAF bases. But then I think some fairly wise people said, these people are being taken out of a war zone. They're scared witless at the sight of uniforms. Doesn't matter what the uniform is. And sending them to military bases was probably not the best idea. Having said that, the military galvanized themselves. They had several bases ready to do it. But the government decided the other day, given where they were coming from, it was better not to use military facilities.
Thank you.
Monsieur Deslay, bienvenue au comité. 6 minutes,
Merci,
s'il vous
Monsieur le
plaît.
Président. Merci, Monsieur Fadden, d'être présent avec nous. C'était assez impressionnant. Moi, je vous engage demain matin dans mon bureau.
Seriously, in an ideal world, who should have the responsibility, in your opinion, of these domestic operations? The federal government, the provincial government, or municipalities? So let's set aside what's happening right now for the moment. I think it belongs to all three. It really depends on the catastrophe in question. I think municipalities should be able to deal with smaller things, but something like Lac Mégantic, I think the province can probably deal with it. But there are disasters where we have to involve all three levels of government. And so I think the answer is not what you want to hear, but I think it's all three, depending on the specific circumstances. And in terms of using private services in this kind of disaster, are you in favor of it? In general, yes, but I think we have to look very particularly at the kind of work. I talked about use of military helicopters earlier, and it's not a very effective use of a very specialized service. There are many services in Canada that have helicopters. And so if we were doing the kind of review that I'm suggesting, we could easily foresee having contracts with those kinds of companies. Then they would provide us with helicopters in the case of disasters. But I think that there is a possible role for the private sector, but also for civil society, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, all of these kinds of organizations. They can mobilize people very, very quickly, and often with qualifications and expertise that the armed forces do not have. And so for me, it's really using everyone, but to do so effectively and efficiently, we have to think of it. Now, during the pandemic, the armed forces have been used in several areas, including in Quebec. Did you believe that that was an adequate use of these resources, and was it the right thing to do during the pandemic? Well, I think using the resources that report to the Surgeon General, yes, but there aren't many people in the armed forces who are doctors and nurses. And so for this very limited number, yes. But using people from the Navy and the Air Force who have no association with health services is not a useful thing. If I recall correctly, we used the Army in Quebec, but we very quickly concluded that, yes, it was helpful, but it's not something we could do in the long term. And if I remember well, I believe that the Red Cross took over in time. But in the short term, do you think it's a good idea, it's adequate to use these people in these circumstances? In a real disaster, we have to use what we have, and I don't think we had any choice, or at least much choice. So to go in quickly and get out quickly, yes, that was the thing to do. If the Prime Minister was talking about a lack of vision, we have short-term solutions and then we move on to the next thing. So really there's a need in this sector and with this whole file to have long-term perspective. So if you were Prime Minister, what would you do? Well, I would do what I suggested to Madam. I would convene what we used to call a Royal Commission of Inquiry. We need a general review that is national, involving everyone, that's relatively independent in order to advise the government. Because I think asking the government or officials to review their own work is always difficult. So people will make an effort, but sometimes if you have people who are arm's length, it's better. So I think that I would say that we need a commission of inquiry that is national and independent to review the whole thing. And once that's done, then the government would be able to decide what to do with their recommendations. So I know that royal commissions of inquiry are not things that people particularly like. They're expensive. It takes a long time. But sometimes we have no choice because it's been some 20 years now that we've talking about managing emergencies in Canada, and we haven't made a great deal of progress. And in your opinion, what are the conclusions would look like what of such a commission of inquiry? One of the conclusions are that we need a lot more coordination between all three levels of government. We have to carefully articulate what the role should be for the private sector and for what we call civil society in English. And once that's been done, allocate the necessary resources, because I think that one of the difficulties that we have today is that resources for every level of government are allocated to deal with immediate problems, but not to start thinking about what we're going to do if we have a catastrophe in 5 years' time. So I criticize my former colleagues and politicians for that. But that's really the reality everywhere at the moment. Do I have some time left? How are the expenses shared when the Army is sent, for example, to Quebec during the pandemic? Well, if I remember correctly, the federal government paid the bill. All of it? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I guess to continue on along those lines, I mean, you were talking about it's too easy for the Prime Minister of the day, whomever, to have that idea of coming to the rescue. It's really quite a political decision. So in order to make this a non-political decision, this Royal Commission would be, I think, I mean, where you're going in terms of that recommendation. Beyond that, though, would you recommend something like a permanent body, away from that political decision-making process, away from that that sort of savior type, not turning your back on the province, all of those things to continue to make those recommendations going forward?
I mean, I think there are people now who advise the Prime Minister of the day, and they do it, I think, as well as anybody could. I think in the end, the Prime Minister of the day has to be the final decision maker. But I think he or she would decide on the basis of the tools that are available to him or her. And right now, most of the time, when there's a disaster of the sort that we have in Atlantic Canada, it's the Canadian Forces. So I think Mr. Trudeau acted entirely rationally. He didn't have any other tools. And they needed help, and they needed it now. My argument is not that he acted illogically, but rather he didn't have any other tools. So the inquiry that I'm advocating would, to begin with, do a compilation of all of the emergency capabilities in the provinces and the municipalities, because I don't think we even have that comprehensively, and then do an examination of the environments I talk about, and then make concrete recommendations on where we would have to, quite candidly, spend money to build this kind of capability. You may want to contract with the private sector, you may want to contract with civil society, you may want to say to the provinces, we're going to give you X millions of dollars to do a limited amount. But what I'm arguing fundamentally is we need to give the government of the day more tools.
So specifically, though, if there was more of that long-term thinking, permanent body that would look at that, that would be one of those, and it would be made up of a lot of the similar people maybe that are around that table now, but more in a permanent, I guess, official type capacity.
Yeah, I would also, I mean, I'm sort of beating myself against the head because I'm arguing against my former colleagues, but I do think public servants have a specific role and they're constrained by the political environment. So I would add to this review body some experts from the outside because they do provide a different perspective. And I think government is entitled to as broad a perspective as we can give them.
So one of the questions I would also shift to, I think, you had talked about the inclusion of the private sector. A lot of some of the witnesses that we had heard from, though, they talked about moving this away from as much focus on the military because it is so costly. I think, Mr. Chair, you had said that they're the most expensive sandbaggers, woodcutters, whatever, yes. So that said, the private sector has a very specific purpose of making money. And so what would be in place to ensure that that was kept under control, so that it was specifically consistently for the public good, not for their own private interests?
Well, I'm not against the private sector making money. What I'm against is the private sector making excessive money in the context of disasters. I think the chair is right when he argues that pretty expensive woodcutters, if you use military helicopters to transport facilities across the country, given the way that over the years Parliament has insisted that the Canadian Forces account for costs, it is much, much more expensive, I think, than contracting with a private company and sort of saying, you know, we need 10 helicopters and for the following prices. I mean, I think you can negotiate reasonably. Just in the interest of clarity, I'm a long-time supporter of the Canadian Red Cross, and I've been associated with them for a while. They have been used over the course of the last several disasters at a cost that is not even in the same realm as the Canadian military. They're far less expensive because they use volunteers, trained volunteers. So you use the private sector when you need things like logistical support. You use civil society, be it the Red Cross or the Salvation Army or whomever, who can draw on many, many volunteers because they maintain those kinds of lists in a way that government does not. And then you use the federal government or the governments generally as a real last resort.
Okay. So again, though, in the private sector, often, again, costs are, or those profits are primary. So oftentimes the argument with the armed forces is that they have that specific training. They are, and you had mentioned that they are trained effectively, fully. So how would a private sector be monitored to deal with that appropriately and not cut costs so that ultimately their people are compensated and trained in the most effective manner?
Well, I think you'd have to go back to what I was saying in my remarks, that you have to divide up the kind of support that the Canadian Forces provide, logistical, administrative, and people. I think if you define precisely what you want from the private sector, if I'm using helicopters because helicopters are used a lot in disasters to move people around, Canadian Forces helicopters, they're attack helicopters by and large. They're excruciatingly expensive. They're expensive to maintain. And people use them, in fact, because they are armed and they can go out and shoot people. They're not designed to move bedding. Whereas you have private sector helicopters that are very, very good at transporting goods. We have any number of companies that we do that. So we issue a standing offer. I mean, I think it would be, I think we would be making the wrong decision if we automatically excluded the possibility of using the private sector. I agree with you, you have to be careful, because not every contract the federal government signs is as cost effective as it might be, but some are. It depends on the circumstances. But it's either doing something like that or we're going to have to continue relying on the military. And the problem there is it cuts down on their operational training, and they're not getting enough of that.
Yeah. Thank you.
I would argue.
Thank you, Ms. Madison. We're on the 5-minute round. We got a little more than 20 minutes to cover off 25 minutes worth of questions. So I will be a little brutal with Mr. Motz and others.
I'm sure
Mr.
you will.
Motz, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fadden, again, it's great to see you, and thank you for being here. We've been studying over the course of the last several months the military readiness, and we've seen some significant inadequacies of in the shortfalls that we have in personnel. And we've now moved into this study, and I think the overlap. After last week's committee meeting, we had Major General Provo and others here. I received some correspondence from someone within the military, and they said the following. Perhaps some of our leaders are too far removed from the reserves to know what's really happening. I'm probably not, a division, and I'm not going to mention it, has lost over 400 reserves in the last 3 years because they're fed up with the government's mandate for the military. They didn't join to clean up domestic disasters. They joined to protect their country. We've never been so vulnerable and so woefully inadequate. Other countries are protecting our north because they know we can't. Championing the military will do wonders for their morale because it's at an all-time low. Life on the base is very different than in Ottawa. If you want to get answers to your questions, ask those on the base, not Ottawa. What are your thoughts to those comments coming from our own members of the armed forces?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think there's some truth to it, but there are also some limitations. If you're a colonel on a base, you don't look at the broader situation. So I think what you need is a combination of the base level perspective with the NDHQ perspective. Neither is complete without the other. One of the things that struck me when I was at DND was all of the more junior people told me they hated being in garrison. They didn't join to be sitting on bases. They just hate it. They want to go to Latvia. They want to go to Ukraine. They want to help with the disaster in Indonesia. But our capabilities now, I think, are becoming so limited that the likelihood of their doing that is less than it used to be.
Thank you for those comments. And I agree with you that, the military being used as a last resort, I think that the last resort has become too easy of a term to be stretched. And you had mentioned with Ms. Gallant some comments about the Canadian Emergency Management College. I happen to be a graduate of that place and had tremendous learning there that I was able to apply in some disasters in my own community. Do you think it's possible that when you look at the totality of the economic impact of a disaster and the cost then to clean it up, that we'd actually save taxpayer dollars federally if the government could stand that college up again and invite our provinces, our municipalities, our NGOs, our civilian organizations to increase the civilian capacity. And in so doing, the need for the federal government to come to the rescue, if you will, of some places would be mitigated. Do you see the long-term gain in something like that?
Yeah, I absolutely do. Is it a solution to the entire problem? It's not, but it's a solution for a big chunk of it. I mean, I think the model should be a national college, not a federal one, with the federal government perhaps taking the lead. But, you know, provinces don't particularly always enjoy joining federal institutions and, as they say, being told what to do and how to do it. So it's a bit like the National Police College. It's run by the RCMP, but it really is nationally administered by all the police forces in the country. So I absolutely think it would be worthwhile. It would need to have its mandate to be carefully defined and resourced adequately. We have a bad habit in this country to create institutions and then not resource them adequately, at least initially when we're setting them up.
Do you, when we look at disasters now, and with the disaster down east now with this hurricane, there might be questions asked of overlap, duplication. So when we're talking about using NGOs and federal resources and governmental organizations, there are duplications sometimes. Is there a way that we could avoid and be more efficient in our response to these?
Well, you're going to accuse me of being repetitious, but I think we need a compilation of what resources are actually available on the ground right now, because I don't think, unless things have really changed a great deal in the 2 or 3 years since I've left government, we don't have that compilation. So how can you plan to avoid overlap if you don't know what's available to begin with, except on the ground where hopefully the senior person would say, for the love of God, you're both doing the same thing, go in an opposite direction. But we need a compilation of what's available to start. Sorry, Chair.
I don't mind taking it out on Mr. Motz. 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît, Monsieur Robillard.
Monsieur Robillard, 5 minutes. Hi, everyone. How long would it take to implement and create a civil organization that would have the same capacity and the same resources as the Canadian Armed Forces currently have to respond to national emergencies? It's almost impossible to have all the same resources as the Canadian Armed Forces, because the Armed Forces have something that other organizations will never have: boots on the ground. In an emergency, we can take 30,000 people and say, go help. But when it comes to administrative resources, logistical tools, and emergency funds or resources, some do exist. But I think your next witness will be from the Red Cross. Ask them the same question. They have sites across the country, and they have resources for emergencies specifically. And we have to increase these resources. It could be done quite quickly, I believe. But when it comes to logistical resources, it could take some time. They have armored personnel carriers that have been used in Alberta with forest fires. They've been used in maritime provinces as well. It's doable, but it takes a few years to reach the same level of capacity.
How can the federal government help provinces more effectively to reinforce their resilience when facing national disasters? Excellent question. I don't think the answer is an easy one, and I'm not certain that I have an ideal answer for you. One part of the problem is that when the federal government raises this kind of issue with the provinces, the initial reaction is always, write me a check. And I understand that in some circumstances that is the right thing to do. But provinces also have integral responsibilities, and I think we simply have to encourage them. One example, a current one, we had a problem in Gatineau not long ago with water in the springtime. There was flooding. So I'll never understand why governments in Canada allow people to build homes and cottages in floodplains where floods are possible, and not just possible but likely. So this kind of thing could be done in collaboration with both levels of government. But there has to be the political will to do so, and it's not possible to just convene that. What could we do at the local, provincial, and federal level to lighten the growing pressure on the Canadian Armed Forces when they are called upon to respond to national disasters? Well, I think that we should insist that all provinces, municipalities, and emergency organizations, first of all, work in collaboration with their counterparts. For example, having a contract between Manitoba and Saskatchewan for the use of the neighboring province because there's been a disaster there. It should be just instinctively something that's already been done. New Brunswick should ask Quebec to help them. It's done informally, but I think that should be formalized. Even that Montreal could ask for assistance from Quebec City, or Trois-Rivières could ask Quebec City for assistance. I mean, we should insist that that kind of collaboration happen. We should facilitate that kind of cooperation. That's one thing we could do. Thank you very much. Sorry. 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you. Some would say that since Canada is a relatively peaceful country, that's to say we're not at war and we don't risk being so like other countries, that we should perhaps amend or modify the mission of the Canadian Armed Forces and parallel, because there are disasters that are occurring already. So how would you react to that? I would not agree with that. We're very lucky here. We're very fortunate. We're not risking being invaded, but we're a member of NORAD. We're a member of NATO. We participate in peacekeeping missions for the United Nations, and we can't do that without trained armed forces. So do we have the perfect balance? It's not up to me to say. But we cannot participate in the international community of the Western world if we don't have trained armed forces. The forces we had in Ukraine and that we have in Estonia currently, it's because they're people who are very well trained, respected by their peers in the West. And going back to natural disasters, do you have any models in mind or winning strategies that you've seen other countries use? Honestly, no. Because I think that our circumstances are very particular. One element in Canada is that we have a vast country, and so preparing something in British Columbia will not necessarily be useful to Newfoundland. So that's just an example. But I think every country has its specificities. I mentioned FEMA earlier, seems to be working in the U.S. for them, but it is federal interference that's quite extreme that we probably wouldn't like in Canada. The British have another system. So I think we'd have to look at the practices elsewhere, coming back to the commission I'm advocating for, and we should look carefully to what the options should be in Canada. Thank you very much.
Ms. Madison.
Yes, so you had mentioned that FEMA has a lot of problems. Do you have the ability to outline them just quickly for us within 2.5 minutes?
Well, I don't know if I can do that, but certainly during the previous administration and the one previous to that, they did not act quickly enough. There's an issue of what is their involvement? Do the states have to ask for assistance? Do they not ask for assistance? The distribution of assets was a problem. I think, like everybody else, they were probably underfunded because people like a peace dividend of one sort or other. If there's not a disaster for 10 years, people start saying, well, we can cut back a bit. I'm not an expert on it. I just know that over the years, they've done some things really well and other things not so well. You'll recall that not the current hurricane in Puerto Rico, but the one 2 ago, they were criticized quite a bit for not being terribly helpful. So I think repeat myself again, you do need a mix of national, federal, and provincial. And if you just put too much at the federal level, it ain't going to work. And the provinces do find frequently their capabilities are exceeded, so you need a mix of the two, which we accept here in principle. I just argue that we need to think about it some more and exercise it more and make sure it's more effective.
Sure. What am I going to do?
Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're talking about attrition. To what extent does the steady attrition of our military impact the ability for them to respond to natural disasters when called upon to do so?
Well, I think quite simply it does. I mean, the military, I think, will tell you that their main responsibility is to maintain their military operational capabilities, and there's a limit to what they can take away. I mean, they cannot move staff from CFB Bagotville or CFB Coal Lake, which is dedicated to NORAD, and all of a sudden have them fight forest fires. I mean, there's a limit somewhere. So you have to draw on the reserves, which we do, you know, intermittently. We have to draw on largely Army units who don't have dedicated functions at a particular point in time. But the fewer troops you have available for military use, active military use, and for training, I mean, the generals will tell you that, you know, for one military person actively, you know, shooting a gun or holding a gun to prevent violence, they need 2 or 3 others in training and all of this stuff. So it's cutting back a lot.
So it's chronic underfunding of the military. Do you think this chronic underfunding and attrition, based on your experience and what you've seen, is intentional on the part of the government?
No. No, I think, for example, Mr. Harper was a wartime prime minister because of Afghanistan. I think I happen to agree with his decision to have us leave Afghanistan because I think the Canadian forces at the time were terribly stretched, and he and his successors did somewhat reduce the size of the military. It's another peace dividend. Did they do that intentionally? No, they did it to try and save money to use on other things. I happen to think, in part because of my experience, that national security is as important as other sectors of activity. Various governments at various times take different views. You know, Mr. Chrétien, he did not want to be the prime minister when 9/11 occurred. You know, the last thing he wanted was to ask Parliament to appropriate $7.9 billion the December after 9/11. But he was forced to do it because of the circumstances. But I do think that prime ministers and governments have their own priorities. I don't think we give enough in Canada to national security, but that's just me, and I'm probably prejudiced because of my jobs over the years. But I think the change in the international environment is such that we're going to have to spend more time, money, and effort on the sorts of things that you're talking about.
Thank you. It's done? Okay, so to what extent do fuel costs, access and capacity impact the ability of a province to deal with a disaster and the speed at which our military can provide assistance to civil authorities if needed?
I mean, I think they all do, because it speaks to the extent to which they have set aside reserves to use for emergencies, and I don't think we do that a lot. You know, I think the military would tell you that give you an example. When I was deputy minister, you know, the military desperately wanted to do more exercises in the far north because we don't do it enough. I think the cost is 4 times as much as an exercise elsewhere. So one exercise in the north means they can't do 3 or 4 others elsewhere. If you apply this same logic to emergency planning, where you have a relatively small amount of money available and all of a sudden fuel costs, for example, are doubled, you can deal with it, you know, by pulling resources here and there. But if you don't have reserves, both in terms of money and facilities set aside, it does slow you down.
Reserve in fuel, are you referring to, or reserves in people?
Generally, everything. I think you need reserves in fuel. I mean, fuel is not a big problem in Canada, but you certainly need to know, you know, we didn't know that what happened in Nova Scotia was, and the Maritimes was going to happen. So it seems to me that a logical question to ask the military is, did you anticipate in one of your scenarios that something like this could happen? If you did, how many armed forces personnel could you have identified within 24 hours to move to the Maritimes? I don't know if they've done it. They used to do it years ago, and then they sort of stopped doing it on a regular basis. But planning for emergency disaster relief is almost as important as the actual bodies on the ground. If you plan properly, it really, really makes a difference.
Mr. May, final 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Fadden, for being here. This has been truly helpful to kind of get your perspective. One of the challenges with going last is much of what I was going to ask has been asked. So I just maybe want to take the time to review and sort of pull this together. You talked about not having the appropriate tools, and I think that's a good place for us to start. You talked about the division between the CAF and NGOs that can step up, like the Red Cross. What do you see as an appropriate division of the responsibilities between the CAF and those NGOs?
That's a good question, I think. I think in a lot of crises, you have a number of stages. You have the immediate relief. Take the fires in Fort McMurray. You had to put the fires out, and by and large, the province dealt with this issue. But then you still have today people who don't have houses and whatnot. So registering these people, providing them with immediate financial assistance, I think an organization like the Red Cross can do this immeasurably better than the Canadian Armed Forces, because it's just not in their headspace. Moving in firefighting equipment from Quebec to help in Alberta, the armed forces are going to be able to do this better than the Red Cross or any other organization because they have the physical assets. So I think it depends on the particular element that you're talking about. But to the extent, one of the questions earlier was about the assistance that was provided in Quebec to long-term care homes. I think in the very short term, they did not have an alternative, so they used the Army. And to the extent they used the Surgeon General's resources, it made sense. Using infantrymen to work in long-term care homes is not good. It's not good for the long-term care home, and it ain't good for the people in the long-term care home. Using people from the Red Cross or another NGO, I think, is immeasurably better, particularly because these people, I think, are better prepared in some ways than the government is. I mean, the Red Cross maintains long lists in all of the provinces of people who are willing to volunteer, both general purpose volunteers, like I would be, but also trauma surgeons. So using that capability, I think, broadly defined, and they're here up next, I think they're your next witness. It would be interesting to see what they say. But, the logistical support of the military to move people, I don't think is going to go away. And just old-fashioned manpower in the final result, where you just need bodies, they have the bodies. The more general purpose bodies. It's a long and inadequate answer, but
No, and I appreciate that. And as somebody, my background is working with nonprofit organizations, and I've worked many years trying to manage large staff teams, including volunteers. There are a lot of challenges with that. There's a lot of limitations in terms of what you can and cannot do. Is the reason in your mind that we haven't gone to that extent to rely on volunteers on more regular basis? Is it a trust issue? Is it like we can't guarantee that we're going to have the right number of bodies with the right training on the ground to deal with some of these things, especially when they're so episodic, right? Like you said, we didn't know necessarily what was coming in the Maritimes. Is it a trust issue?
I don't think so. Not really. But
let me rephrase it. Is it a political issue? I mean, we're hearing from premiers right now saying, "Send in the troops. We need the troops." They're not saying, "Send in the Red Cross."
No, because in this particular circumstance, the Red Cross can't cut wood. They could, in fact, though, register people who don't have electricity and provide them with immediate financial assistance, I think, better than the forces could. So it depends on the particular function. I don't think it's a question of trust, to go back to your earlier way of putting it. I think they haven't used them as much as they could have because they didn't have to. I mean, I think disasters are occurring much more frequently now, and I think it's now forcing everybody to sort of think, oh, my God. But if you ask both the military and the Red Cross, for example, who did what during COVID, I think you will, not just the military, if you ask PHAC, the Public Health Organization, and Health Canada, I think you will find that they found the services of the Red Cross without any great difficulty as meeting the standard they were trying to set. But again, like everything else, you need to plan, you need to exercise, you need to agree on who does what to whom. And I think we're getting there slowly just because we're having to deal it time after time. I'm a believer that, as I was saying earlier, planning makes a big difference on the ground. And that's what we're not doing enough of, I think.
Mr. May, and with that, it brings us to a close. Before I let you go, and you may have an answer to this question or not, but the price per hour of a helicopter is staggering, absolutely staggering. And I don't think the public has any real feel for that. And this is probably an unfair question, but I ask it all the time. Do you have any recollection of or estimation of the price of just sending in a helicopter on a per hour basis?
I don't. I'm sure the military could tell you, but as I was saying to Ms. Matheson, part of the issue on funding or costing for the military is because of the preoccupations of Parliament over the years, that the costing be utterly and completely comprehensive, taking into account all repairs, all upgrading, all facilities. And going back to your question, if you're dealing with a private sector helicopter, you don't have all of that. They want to make a little bit of money on the use of the helicopter for this time frame, and so they'll charge you whatever they're charging you, and it will be a lot less than what the military is charging.
Yeah, I know military accounting is mysterious to behold. Yeah. Yes.
Responsible for it as the deputy minister, and I can't say that I mastered it entirely. It is very, very complicated.
I appreciate it. Mr. Fadden, once again, you have provided an intelligent, articulate analysis of this issue, and I particularly appreciate it, and I know the committee does. So with that, we will suspend and re-empanel in a minute or two. Thanks very much. hour. Okay. Our second hour is with witnesses from the Red Cross. Mr. Sauvé, welcome to the committee. And Amy Avis, General Counsel and Chief of Recovery, welcome to the committee. And Mr. Botha, Assistant Deputy Minister of Emergency Measures from Manitoba, welcome to you all. We just had our first taste of somebody actually in the flesh, in the committee. It was positively exciting, but we're back to virtual representation. So with that, I'm going to ask the representatives of the Red Cross for a 5-minute presentation, and then move to Manitoba for another 5 minutes, and then we'll go to rounds of questions. With that, whomever. Mr. Sauvé?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for having us here to speak today. My name is Conrad Sauvé. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Red Cross, and I'm joined today by my colleague Amy Avis, who's General Counsel and lead for our recovery, risk reduction, and resilience programs. We're joining here from Ottawa, which is the unceded territory of Anishinaabe people. And I'd like to start by thanking the committee members for your leadership in the timely study of Canada's domestic response capacity. My presentation is in English, mais je suis tout à fait ouvert pour tout.
But I'm very happy to respond to questions in French.
Here, with increased frequency and severity, we're seeing the growing impact of climate change on Canadian communities. In the last 2 years alone, the Canadian Red Cross has responded to floods and fires in BC, an annual flooding in northern Manitoba in Indigenous communities, and our teams are currently on the ground supporting those impacted by Hurricane Fiona in Atlantic Canada. Unfortunately, these events are not isolated incidents. What once was a once-in-a-lifetime disaster is increasingly an annual event stretching Canada's emergency management system to its limits. When I started with the Red Cross, our emergency operations were almost entirely international. Today, 90% of our efforts are focused on assisting Canadians at home. At the Red Cross, we believe the time has come to stop treating these large-scale events as exceptional, and we must do more now to prepare ourselves for a new normal. This must include seeking new ways to adapt, enhance, modernize Canada's response capacity, and reduce the current strain on governments and response organizations, including the Canadian Armed Forces. And while the Canadian Armed Forces have always been there to help in times of disaster, they must remain the force of last resort and should not be the only permanent national surge capacity in times of emergencies. Now, as we seek to address gaps in Canada's emergency management capacity, we can point to a few critical lessons we've learned during the past 2 years responding to COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks to an unprecedented funding from the Government of Canada, the Canadian Red Cross was able to build the first ever humanitarian workforce comprised of thousands of Canadians across the country, eager and willing to lend their skills and expertise. These efforts began in the spring of 2020 as part of a highly successful effort to relieve the Canadian Armed Forces in long-term care homes in Quebec and Ontario. The highly collaborative effort saw the Canadian Red Cross and CAF personnel sharing skills, experience, and lessons learned to ensure Canadians were well supported throughout the transition. In fact, prior to our deployment, the Canadian Red Cross helped to train hundreds of CAF members in epidemic prevention control measures. Since that time, this investment has resulted in more than 7,500 Red Cross personnel deployments to respond to more than 180 requests for assistance from federal, provincial, and territorial partners. Even today, the Canadian Red Cross continues to deploy health human resources into communities to support COVID-19 outbreaks, as well as ongoing vaccination clinics across the country, but particularly in the north. And while our country must be hugely grateful to the Canadian Armed Forces for their effort responding to COVID-19, we have learned that with strategic foresight a continued investment, the development and maintenance of emergency health support is a role that organizations like the Canadian Red Cross can and should be trusted to play. In addition to the gap in humanitarian service delivery early in the pandemic, we are also increasingly seeing gaps in civil protection capabilities, such as critical work CAF is supporting in Atlantic Canada. The Canadian Red Cross has recently studied a number of emergency management models internationally, including discussions with our Red Cross counterparts in Germany, Australia, and the United States. We have seen, in terms of best practices for Canada's emergency strategy that clearly articulates predefined roles and responsibilities and capabilities for each actor. These are further strengthened with appropriate funding and coordination structures to ensure effective readiness and deployment of these resources. Now, while these models all include a mandate for civil protection capability, they also recognize and define auxiliary role for their National Red Cross Society on the provision of humanitarian services. As we look at potential options for such models in Canada, we also caution that any model must be built for purpose, considering the unique risk, people, and geography of our country.
Mr. Sauvé, I apologize for interrupting, but I'm running a hard clock here.
Right.
So maybe you could work in the balance of your remarks in response to questions, if that would work out for you. So let me turn to Mr. Botha, 5 minutes. And again, I apologize, but the clock is the enemy on all of these hearings. Mr. Botha?
No problem, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Good day, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Dr. Johan Boet. I'm the Deputy Minister responsible for emergency management in the province of Manitoba. I'm joining you from Winnipeg and the vast traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Quick bit about me within the 5 minutes. I've got practical emergency management experience as an Army officer and is, of course, overseeing emergency management in Manitoba. And on the academic side, my PhD focused on emergency management and my textbook on the role of all governments in the military and emergency management in Canada is published by UFT Press earlier this year. So I think I'll skip to the end of my presentation just to capture the nuts and bolts, and then I can go back to other comments during questions. While the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces prioritize their vision around national defense and the maintenance of Canada's sovereignty, backed by force if need be, multiple iterations of a NDDN CAF strategic documents has acknowledged CAF's ongoing humanitarian role in domestic disaster response to natural disasters. This acknowledgement has, at least up to now, reflected the current reality as provinces across the Federation repeatedly call on the federal government for military support during large-scale responses, mainly to provide, organize, and maintain itself while executing an array of response actions. And I should stress labor, because boots on the ground is by far the bulk of the need identified by receiving jurisdictions over assets like helicopters and specific expertise. The last decade and a half have seen CAF successfully integrate into the provincial, municipal, indigenous response systems on the ground during, again, large-scale disaster responses. And numerous events, whether we're talking wildfires, floods, rains, hurricanes, and of course the pandemic, has seen CAF provide crucial capacity while ensuring overall domestic disaster response remains under civilian direction and control. The reality is, at least sort of from the research perspective of all large events, again, I would stress large events since 2007, is that Canada simply does not currently have a large response capacity without significant heavy lifting from the Canadian Armed Forces. And this does reflect an ongoing and growing trend to use military forces to augment natural disaster response across comparable countries, including federal states like the United States and in Australia. So, from, again, the more sort of the research perspective on large-scale events since 2007, continued success in Canadian disaster response will likely require the CAF, without, of course, undermining its primary mission of protecting Canadian sovereignty, be ready to deploy domestically to save lives and property from disasters. The research is clear that while some aspects of military expertise and organizational capacity can absolutely be transferred to civilian aspects of emergency management, the large, well-trained, and again, self-supported labor force that comes with the military deployment has no obvious replacement in the Canadian context at this time. And in reality, we work with our Red Cross partners all the time, and they're phenomenal. But these volunteer organizations does not come close during large-scale disaster response, in part because military personnel accept and understand that they are subject to being lawfully ordered into harm's way under conditions that could lead to the loss of their lives. So while I'm not here to weigh in on any policy decisions, I would say that the emergency management research points us to not to the question of whether to use the military in large-scale disaster response or not, but whether the military has the ongoing support, capacity, and indeed the morale to continue to support domestic disaster responses while achieving its primary objective of national defense. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
With that, we'll go to the 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Allison.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to our guests for being here today. I'm going to ask my first question to Mr. Sauvé. Thanks for being on. I know Red Cross obviously has got a great reputation around the world. You guys are always seen as an honest broker and someone that can be trusted. I know when I chaired Foreign Affairs, we talked about you guys getting into Syria with Red Crescent and was one of the few trusted NGOs on the ground that could actually get in there. Let's bring it back home here. Talk to us about the size. You said you have thousands of people, but more specifically, are those volunteers and the size of your operation more specific to certain provinces? So do you have an overall breakdown of what you have in terms of numbers of volunteers / organizations provincially, and how easy is that to transfer based on what's going on the ground?
Well, thank you for your question. And actually, I heard a little bit the last participant, Mr. Fadden, as he ended. You know, if we take COVID experience and in some cases it's volunteers and staff, it's all about what are we building the capacity for? What are we planning for? So during when COVID happened, we were asked to replace the military. We didn't have that capacity, but we built it. Actually, we built it to what was required. And we built a part permanent capacity. It wasn't all volunteers to that response. To this date, we have volunteer capacity throughout the province. Throughout the provinces, we have presence everywhere, and we have some interoperable capacity so we can bring it from one place to the other. But I think a lot of this conversation here, and my ending point actually to my presentation was, what are the risks we're looking at? When are we? What are the capacities we need to build? Understanding that, and right now we're using the military consistently for lack of being prepared in other aspects, lacking have local capacity trained and having that objective. And I'm not saying in every case you don't need the military. In some cases, in some exceptional cases, but it seems to be the only tool in the toolbox. So what are the risks we're facing, and what capacities we need to support and train locally? And that's a mixture of staff, of course, and volunteers. You know, we're looking at the fire after the fire starts. We're not spending a lot of money building the fire station in the civil protection area.
You talk about capacity and some of the things that you guys, and you're right, what you had capacity before, maybe expanding as time goes on. Would you just share with us sort of the different levels of what you're involved in? I mean, you know, we see taking money, you know, obviously for people to get money deployed. You talk about fire. Talk to us about some of the capacities that you guys are involved in domestically.
So I think our major role domestically is in supporting. We're seeing that in the immediate phase of the emergency, whether it's in the sheltering, that's at different levels with local governments and provincial governments. We've seen our role grow in providing immediate assistance, cash assistance to people that are being displaced, housing. And then, of course, the recovery programs. To give you a bit of an idea of the scale, in the last 5 years, we've supported over 700,000 Canadians that have been affected. So the Red Cross is concentrating, when we're talking a lot of it, on the individuals that are impacted and supporting them in their situation. And of course, it's bringing us into the challenges also of recovery and supporting people that have lost everything during that, sometimes the months and sometimes the years after an event.
Now, you have a Red Cross emergency response units. So talk to us about, have you used them or how often? And do you see, obviously we've talked about a potentially a greater need in the future, but talk to us a bit about your Red Cross emergency response units and what they've done or what they are capable of doing.
Well, I think our main role right now is, again, supporting sheltering. Depending on the situation, not every population requires shelter. Some people will go to family and friends, and it's supporting them. So that's that presence and that training in terms of that side. What's been new during COVID is to provide support on the health side. And this is where the military was asked to intervene. And that went from everything from vaccinations to ICU nurses that we deployed to our field hospitals that we built for international. So we deployed 4 field hospitals. So we have a number of capacities there. And then we deployed, of course, we helped with the quarantine of Canadians and different situations. So again, we have an expandable capacity, we have a present capacity, but again, it's looking at what the risks are. And in terms of our role, what we're seeing, of course, is the need to better prepare local communities in terms of what they're going to be facing, better prepare Canadians in terms of the risks, better intervening and having the systems to support them in terms of evacuations and whatnot, and better helping with the recovery and the mitigation, the early warning systems, etc. So the Red Cross is involved very much on the people side. Now, part of the conversation here has been about the boots on the ground and heavy machinery, which we're not involved in. However, our experience has been that there is often local capacity in the private sector. To give you an example, and we're talking about Manitoba a few years ago, we chartered over 250 small planes to support the evacuation of over 10,000 First Nation members of different communities in the north. So we have the logistical capacity to use that. But in order to do that and use the private sector, you need to understand what the risks are. You need to organize your inventory of capacities, and you need to have them ready. The challenge is when you do that.
I apologize, Mr. Sauvé. Your answers are quite thoughtful. But Mr. Allison's time is up. In order to get his finished, Mr. Baptiste, 6 minutes. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for having me at the Defense Committee. And first of all, to the Red Cross, Conrad and Amy, I have to say thank you. Thank you for all that you're doing. On September 24th, as a Cape Breton Member of Parliament, I woke up to damage that I can only describe as overwhelming, with trees being blown down over power wires, telephone poles down, buildings that have had their roofs ripped off, other buildings that have had bridges run into them from the flooding and high tides that just made the damage just unspeakable. And all we knew that was we needed help. We didn't know where that help would come from, but when you wake up to that disaster, you have all levels of governments trying to figure out where to go. And for any leaders who wake up to this kind of disaster, I'm wondering if you could give us very compactly, what is the role that Red Cross plays as in comparison to what the Department of Defense does? And if you could just do that in about 2 minutes, I would really appreciate that.
Right. So I think in exactly that situation, our role is to support the individuals. And what we're looking at in Atlantic Canada is we're registering people, and why registering is exactly to have a direct relationship with those that are affected, and to be able to provide financial assistance or other assistance to them, including psychosocial in some cases, to people that are impacted. So it's very much in that sense. And of course, in the case of any kind of disasters, a number of people will be evacuated to shelters, and we are, among others, supporting municipalities in sheltering and supporting that. Hopefully, the situation won't be too long for most people, but for some, they will be away from their homes for a longer time. And in many of the cases, we will be supporting them with temporary housing or interim housing for the months and years ahead, and looking at how we can support the gaps in when the gaps in financial assistance that will be there as well. And that's why we're raising money as well. So that's very much in supporting the individuals in that situation.
We heard a little bit of the testimony that the Canadian Armed Forces were able to do things like using power saws to cut down trees. Can you give us a little sense of what you understand as the role that Canadian Armed Forces play during these disasters?
Well, I think what we've seen in the last year, and that's why I'm giving the example of, is it the appropriate tool, the armed forces, for all these situations, or are there other capabilities on the ground that can be local capacities that can be trained for this? Our experience is, there are always other capabilities, not in every case, and sometimes the military is necessary, but because we haven't identified what those risks are, we haven't looked at who can help in those situations. We're caught unprepared, and then we need a rapid response, which the military has. And I think the other speaker from Manitoba said that very well. The question is, do we have other existing capabilities? And in order to understand that, we understand the risks and do that inventory. And a lot of civil protection response is around looking at the capacities, because the first response is always in the community, the local community. Have you prepared them properly? Have you trained people properly? Have you prepared them to face their risks properly? And after that, you have the response. So I think we have to heighten that side of our response in Canada and as a civil protection, and looking at civil society in that respect.
Can you tell me a little bit, one of the things the federal government said is that we would match dollar for dollar all the funds raised for Fiona. Can you tell me what we've raised so far, and what can the people in my riding of Sydney Victoria expect for the next little while for the Red Cross to be able to do? I know that the Prime Minister announced $300 million for the long-term recovery, but for the short term, that people who are throwing out food from their fridges, there's 8% of the people in my riding still don't have power. What is it that the Red Cross is doing, and how much dollars do they have currently? And I've got about a minute for your answer.
Okay, I'm going to go fast. I think we've raised to date about $12 million, maybe just a little bit more. $15 million, I'm told. So we're in the process of raising that. We're asking everybody to register with us to exactly look at their needs and how we can use that money the most efficiently. Again, complementary to what the provinces are doing. So we're looking at that right now. All monies raised will be there to help individuals and also help local organizations. So the registration helps us, exactly to your point, understand what those needs are. And again, with the sums, we will distribute them to those who need it the most.
Seconds. Can you give me a sense of, if there are fundraisers taking place in Cape Breton, when do they have a date to get Red Cross the dollars in order to be able to be matched by the federal government?
I'm sorry, you're asking me if we receive donations, when they will be matched? Is that your question?
What is the expiry date of the matching? Like, if someone has...
Oh, yes. The initial expiry date is 30 days, but I'm understanding that that may be prolonged, actually. So, but presently it was 30 days from a few days ago. So in the next coming weeks, all dollars will be matched. And again, we will share exactly how we will distribute that. And again, the registration is key for us because it's understanding the needs. And of course, we will use all the funds to support those immediate needs, and again, support local organizations as well. So we're doing that assessment now at the same time as we're raising the money.
Thank you, Mr. Baptiste. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
6 minutes, Mr. Desilets. Thank you. My question is for Mr. Sauvé. Earlier, you heard Mr. Fadden say that he was recommending an independent commission of inquiry being set up, given the importance and the complexity of these interventions in crisis situations, which risk becoming more and more numerous. Well, I didn't hear what Mr. Fadden said. I didn't hear that part of it, but certainly I think We have to take the time to well understand what the last events of the last few years have been and how we responded to it. What are the weaknesses? Do we have unused capacity in the community because we're poorly prepared? I think that's one of the very important issues. What I heard was just the end of his testimony, with which I agree entirely. We have to better understand the risks and be better prepared. So it's not, I mean, we're talking a lot about interventions after the fact here, but I think that a lot has to happen in preparatory stages. Better understand the risk and be better prepared locally to face them. And that's another question for you. You alluded earlier to the fact that 86% of your interventions are currently happening in Canada rather than what was happening in earlier times. So given that and given your capacity, your within to react domestically, are you in a position to respond to increasing demand over the next few years? I think that we won't be if we don't invest more in our basic capabilities. And I have to thank the federal government. They invested after COVID in a more permanent capability, and these are important parts of the conversation here. We have to invest in our capabilities, but also over the last few years, we were responding. We'd like to work in a context, within a context when we could participate in simulations and prepare ourselves for risks and responses and coordinate our efforts in advance. So we have to take note of the fact that these kinds of events will be repeating more often, and we have to invest in our permanent capabilities, not just in our response where and when that happens. My next question is for Mr. Botha. With your expertise and the experience that you have, your university studies that you've done, if you had to make recommendations to this committee, what would they be?
I will certainly echo Mr. Sauvé's emphasis on greater preparedness, especially at the local level. Increasing municipal emergency management capacity will, through civil society, volunteer organizations, preparedness at the individual level, the family level, the residential level, all of that I think is very important. But what I would tell this committee is, even if all that preparatory activities occurred, and even if we had large-scale infrastructure mitigation layered on top to reduce disaster impacts, for the large-scale events like we're seeing in Fiona at the moment, there is no obvious labor alternative to the Canadian Armed Forces and what they can bring to bear. It's also important to note that what makes Canada a bit unique compared to other comparable federal countries like the US and Australia is the Canadian Armed Forces is the one operational player that links municipal, federal, and provincial responses. Otherwise, we're very decentralized. If you deploy it into a disaster zone anywhere in the country, 9 times out of 10, you're going to see a lot of provincial activity with their EM partners. The one player that links all 3 levels is often those frontline soldiers and their chain of command. So there's a operational matrix that the armed forces allows during large-scale response. So my recommendation to the committee would be, for again, large-scale responses, look to how can CAF be supported in terms of their capacity, but also their morale. We've heard before that there is maybe a sense of not feeling a ton of motivation for domestic disaster response. Like in combat, the will to fight on the humanitarian side, it will be very important. So what is happening to enhance morale on the CAF side? Because I think the research is quite clear from the trends from 2007 onwards, at least. They will be needed.
Merci. Dernière question.
Thank you. Last question. In your opinion, Mr. Botha, once again, the Canadian Armed Forces, do they really have the capability to respond to what what we're asking them to do, operationally speaking?
Very briefly, please.
Thank you for that. I think not quite at this time. I think they need greater capacity, and that's clear because receiving jurisdictions almost always ask for more than that they receive, especially on the labor front.
Ms. Madison, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. To Mr. Boda, I think a question that has come to my mind often, there's been a lot of conversations about different provincial governments not putting in as many resources simply because of costs and abilities into those emergency management systems, and a reliance upon the armed forces to not even just be the last resort, but the only, and the lack of tools and so on and so forth. But ultimately, what's your response to the idea or the fact that there are certain provinces that are hit more often with the need for emergency response? I mean, I think of your province of Manitoba and the yearly flooding that occurs up north, especially in the impacts on First Nations. How can the federal government, I guess, play a role or help provincial governments who have more of that necessary response or that needed response in opposed to others, and how can we find that balance?
Thank you so much for the question. So I think my operational experience, I'd like to note that while a request for assistance for military support occurs essentially every year somewhere in the country, it's very rare for a particular provincial jurisdiction to be requesting support every single year. So if from the national perspective, you're seeing a lot of military activity to support domestic disaster response. But if you just isolate into one jurisdiction, it's not occurring as frequently as one might think. Operationally, if the Manitoba Emergency Measures Organization, like its provincial counterparts, wants to issue a request for assistance, there's a lot of legwork that needs to be done to demonstrate the true need. It's not an easy lever to pull by any means. In terms of how there could be maybe greater support from the federal side, I think, like you note in the question, it goes back to some of the risk assessment work that the committee has already identified as important. Where do we have cyclical hazards? Where do we have hazards that can be pretty much predicted? And in those cases, maybe that is where provincial emergency management capacity can ramp up and be stable, maybe not expect federal support, and have that kind of federal support ready for the break glass moments where we may not have anticipated it as much, like this experience in Fiona or like the pandemic experience.
I'll switch to questions for the Red Cross. We had heard about the legal liabilities in terms of those emergency responses, and certainly the armed forces, in terms of those unique capabilities that we talk about a lot, they have that legal status or that structure. They can go into those dangerous situations. Can you discuss from the Red Cross's point of view, like, do you face a lot of those same legal liability issues? How do you deal with them, and how do you separate those from when the Army comes or the Canadian Armed Forces come in? What are your experiences on that?
Well, certainly. Well, I have with us our lead counsel, so she's quite capable of talking about liability, but we responded, as we talked about earlier, to 180 requests for assistance from the provinces during COVID, where we deployed personnel in COVID situations. And maybe Amy Avis can talk a bit about our liability infrastructure. We work with the federal government and the provinces in that respect as well to provide cover. Amy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the Canadian Red Cross has an extremely high risk appetite. And so it differentiates us from other NGOs in the sense that we're able to assess, absorb, and mitigate risk. Absolutely, we had to cross the threshold of risk sharing with different government departments in the context of COVID and other large-scale responses. But we were able to kind of traverse that and, in partnership with federal authorities, find a way to risk share where appropriate. But again, we heavily rely on our capacity to risk mitigate and our high risk appetite.
Okay. So you also mentioned, Mr. Sauvé, about the training and the required training. And there were some questions that I had before and to previous witnesses about the armed forces potentially taking on that training. And would the Red Cross be interested in I guess it would be part of that mitigation of liability when you had those higher trained possibilities in the Canadian Forces taking on the training specific part. Is that a
The
possibility?
training, you're asking the Red Cross training for, I'm sorry, I'm not following that question.
Sorry, so when they're put into situations, if we're talking about those wood cutting, potentially maybe more dangerous, a little more dangerous, not the high end that the armed forces would be necessary to perform, but ultimately, would that be valuable? Is that a possibility for that training?
Yeah, no, I mean, you have to remember, I talked about the majority of our responses have been increasingly in Canada in the last few years, but prior to that, and then presently, the Canadian Red Cross and the honourable member, I think one of my first questions reminded me of the past thing we've deployed in Syria, we've deployed in numerous situations of both conflict and natural disasters. We've responded to a number of earthquake operations. I think that's an important part of how we maintain our experience. We have mobile field hospitals, so we are experienced in deploying in complex situations. I think a lot of the situation here, and I think you had a question earlier about events that are happening more and more often, and I think it's right. I think everywhere, in my experience in Canada, is that we're starting to realize that these events are happening more and more, and we haven't quite adjusted in terms of how we're preparing for that and how we're understanding the risk. This is a new reality everywhere. Again, the events were happening once. If they happen once in your lifetime, you don't feel like you need to set up a system. But when they may happen a few times in a year, you need to adjust. And we're into exactly that point. And I think that's probably the point Mr. Fadden was making earlier. We need to understand the whole response. Yeah.
I unfortunately, Mr. Sauvé, I seem to have a facility for cutting you off, which is not something I really work at. Colleagues, we have a little over 15 minutes to ask 25 minutes worth of questions, and I have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. So arbitrarily, I'm going to say those with 5 minutes now have 3, those with 2.5 now have 1. So 3 minutes to Mr. Motz.
Thank you, Mr. Sauvé. Don't take it personally. He cuts me off all the time. So to you, sir, You talked about private citizen donations, and in this particular circumstance with Fiona, the Fed are going to match whatever public donations come in. But can you explain under what circumstances the federal government actually pays for your operations?
Yeah, well, we have some standing capacity that's funded by the government. We have some of it's paid by also our annual donations and our capacity. I mean, we have a regular presence of volunteers and staff that are present already in all the provinces. We also have agreements with the provinces as well, and the municipalities as well. So in the case of this Fiona, we are also working with provincial authorities to distribute some of their assistance as well. So we're playing all those roles. So we have part of that standing capacity. But I think overall, if we look at the threats that are coming, what we're saying both to the federal government and the provincial governments is we need to increase our capacity and our standing capacity in funding, not just in emergencies. Everybody wants to contribute to the Red Cross when an emergency happens, but a lot of our work needs to happen before that. And I think my colleague from Manitoba also mentioned the need for preparedness and local preparedness, which is critical here in understanding your risks. When we help Canadians in these that have lost everything, more often than not, they say us they didn't think it would happen to them. So how are we increasing our understanding of risk and how we're sharing that is going to be critical.
Right, I'm just trying to determine, you have your own self-public funding and donations, but you also get significant cost recovery, if you will, from the federal government. And how do you determine your when you send a bill, if you will, to the government, however you do that? How do you determine what your expectation is for payment from the government, And how do you compare your organization's efficient use of taxpayer dollars with other NGOs?
I suspect that
well-
you're going to be able to answer one question or the other, but not both.
Right.
You have 45 seconds.
Okay. Well, very fast. I think during COVID was the first time we got standing core funding to maintain a humanitarian workforce. This is a $32 million funding right now for the maintenance of our capacity, which includes some COVID response. So this is a new reality. This has been extended for a year. But that was the first time. We have not had funding before in terms of our response. That helps us with our standing capacity, and this is a new reality. I'd like to answer the other one, but it's a longer question in terms of... right.
Quite a thoughtful question, but still too long. Monsieur Robillard, 3 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
You have 3 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sauvé, how much time would it be necessary to set up and to train a civil organization that would have the same capacity and the same means than the means that the Canadian Armed Forces have today to respond to national emergencies? Well, I cannot really answer you because I don't think that we've actually worked together yet to determine what level of risk we actually want to be able to respond to, what kind of events we are expecting, and then what measures do we want to put in place in terms of capacity. I can give you an example, though. Within a few months, we were asked, and this was an exceptional situation, to replace the Army in the long-term responses. So we have a certain capacity for upcoming risks, but this really depends on the level of risk that we're going to respond to. So it's impossible to actually respond specifically to your question or in specific terms. When there is an emergency, domestic emergency situation, does it happen that responses from NGOs or government authorities actually are duplicated? I mean, how can we avoid this type of situation and make responses as efficient as possible? Well, I think there is a very good collaboration of all organizations in Canada. I would say that the issue or the challenge is not the duplication. It's rather events that are major in their scope and capacities, which are pushed to their limits. Now, when we look at the number of events occurring, so it's much more in a context, especially with regard to the work of the committee, saying that if you use the Army very frequently, it's because it's the only tool that you have in your emergency response toolbox, and it means that you haven't really tapped into the capacity of the civil society to respond to these types of situations. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is to Mr. Boda, and it's the same question I asked Mr. Sauvé earlier. Mr. Fadden earlier has suggested, or has recommended rather, or indicated that it would be a good idea to have an independent commission of inquiry. And I would like to have your opinion. Is that realistic? Is that relevant? Would that be helpful? And if not, what could be done in order to plan, anticipate all of this?
Question. I think if a commission shines greater light on this emergency management disaster response space, because it is a complex policy area and it's a growing one, then I think it can be only good, and everyone who works in my field would agree. But I think the committee can appreciate that those kind of bodies will probably not lead to short-term or medium-term solutions. So I think more practically, the kind of suggestions that Mr. Sauvé has emphasized from a preparedness perspective, enhancing civilian emergency management capacity, are all very good ones that the provinces and the federal government should look at. I would just caution, as I think I have throughout, not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because there is a certain tier, a certain level of support that we won't be able to replace, and that the military has.
So then 1 minute, please.
1 minute. So we've talked a lot about the frequency of the need, frequency of events that are occurring, and the need for intervention. The Canadian Armed Forces, they have pay, benefits, pensions, supports for their people, those boots on the ground. Obviously, there are so many incredible Canadians that are motivated to help their neighbors, to help people. But what are the biggest challenges when you're talking about that volunteer force? What are the stresses on them, and how, when we're asking so much more of them in particular situations, how do you manage that at a volunteer level?
Is that for the question for me? I'm sorry. Yep. Yes. Well, I think yes, no, I think there's stresses, but I think we've seen it in COVID as well. Canadians want to help. We've got tremendous, the provinces that opened this up had tens of thousands of offers of Canadians that wanted to provide, that wanted to lend a hand. But you can't organize that after an event. You have to organize that before. You have to train people before. And just to balance a little bit what I was saying before, I'm not saying that the military never should be used. I'm just saying have we prepared properly and we've invested properly. So we have never seen a lack of willingness of Canadians to want to help out in this situation. But how do you harness that help efficiently? Prepare it, channel it properly, that has to be done before. And I think this is where there needs to be more investment.
Thank you. Ms. Masson, Mr. Allison, 3 minutes.
Thank you. You were talking about the different levels of emergency response, the coordination. You also talked about the fact we do need the Canadian military. There's been some discussion about a FEMA-based type organization that's not always maybe the best, but it's, it is an option. So based on your research and what you've looked at in terms of chain of command and how we've got multiple levels of government, what would be sort of your recommendation then as we move forward? You did mention that, that's one of the benefits of federal, the Canadian Armed Forces, they have that chain of command and it ties it all together. But in lieu of that, what would be your recommendations on how we sort of tie all these things together when it comes to all the various levels of government?
So, right. Sorry, Mr. Survey, I thought the question was to me.
Yeah, it was Mr. Boda.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. So in a nutshell, I would, based on empirical evidence, I would strongly urge the committee not to consider a FEMA model in the Canadian context. And the reason for that is the key aspects of effective disaster response, whether it's information sharing, flexibility, support of each other, collective conflict resolution, clear roles and responsibilities, coordination, integration, trust amongst partners. All these things can be measured across disaster events. They have been measured. And our model in the Canadian context is not perfect, but we score higher on all those than on our American counterparts. And a big part of that is the FEMA intrusion and blurring of lines of responsibility. So I would, in a nutshell, say, do not look there. The military is nice in the Canadian context because it augments, but it does not come and take command and control. So it's a resource that sort of spools out across the country, but it doesn't have this FEMA model of attempting to deploy into a region that it doesn't know as well as the provinces or the municipalities would.
Okay, 1 minute. I don't know how you ask a question, get an answer in a minute here, but also mentioned, Mr. Fadden mentioned in terms of emergency response plans. This is back to Mr. Boat as well, because this is what you've studied and what you've written on. Have we done as good a job as we could on emergency preparation plans and actually following through on those?
We haven't, but it might not be for the reason that you think. We're very good at writing down detailed plans, especially at a provincial and a municipal level. But as any good soldier will tell you, a plan never survives contact with the enemy. And so what I think we should do is, as opposed to detailed plans that will identify any eventuality and then hope that we have a response action that matches it, what we need is higher level plans that are exercised way more. And this is at the municipal and the provincial level. So we haven't done that very well. We're not very good at exercising our plans continuously. We're very good at writing them down, for forever. We've got big tombs of them. But I'd say shorter plans, exercise more frequently would be the way to go.
Thank you. Ms. O'Connell, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Soulé, Did you have recommendations, because we didn't get to hear the last bit of your prepared remarks, did you have additional recommendations for this committee to consider that perhaps we didn't get to? Just given the short amount of time, I wanted to at least give you the opportunity to put that on the record.
Well, thank you. Actually, yes, it was really the and again, I agree with the Manitoba colleague in terms of the necessity to bring the military as a last resort, but really to focus on a civilian response capability. And I'm not saying the Red Cross necessarily in all aspects. There are aspects we play in there, but again, we're using the military as a last tool. The last comment is very important as well. We don't understand our risks. We don't prepare our response capability according to those risks, and we don't exercise. And so we don't maintain capacity from one event to another, and we're unprepared. So this is all part of a larger culture, and I think it's an important part of civil society, keeping the military last. And if I may have a few minutes, I'd invite my colleague, Amy Avis, who's looked at different civil response systems in 3 countries and could say a few words if you allow me in your time. Amy?
I would just offer briefly, I completely agree with the FEMA model. In addition to the command and control, it's also around criticism and its inability to reach vulnerable populations and working in that regard. I think that when we look at the German model or some of the models in the EU, engaging the citizenry is so powerful, but there has to be a recognition of the investment in local capacities. And we haven't seen that globally, that balance between engaging citizens, having a specialized workforce, local capacities, and reaching those at-risk and vulnerable populations is my submission.
Okay. You got another minute.
I would quickly ask if I can, Mr. Butha, if I'm saying it correctly, sorry if I'm not, just quickly, what would be the best way to engage with provinces and territories? What do they need from the federal government that would start this conversation in terms of building that capacity and having that joint partnership?
So there is a fairly good relationship between public safety and the emergency management agencies at the provincial level across the country. And one of the aspects that we are focusing on as an initiative is a humanitarian workforce model. And what could that look like? So the relationship exists. I would just say that to continue to support it. But that link between Public Safety Canada and the EM side in each province is quite robust. Of course, it doesn't always include some of this discussion around the military and national defense. So that might have to be fused into it. And every single EMO across the country has good links to the Red Cross, and we have these kind of discussions quite frequently as well.
I just wanted to, on behalf of the committee, thank you for your presentations, both thoughtful and very thought-provoking. But I also wanted to, I'm sure, all of us associate with Mr. Batista's comments about the role of the Red Cross in the last few days and weeks in this last disaster. It's been very impressive and I know very much well received by not only the local population but the Canadian population writ large. So thank you. And I know it's kind of trite but true. We say thank you for your service, but in this particular case, thank you for your service. Both organizations have been very impressive. Colleagues, before I bring down the gavel, witnesses, you're free to go as you see fit. Ironically, public safety will be our first witness Thursday morning, and we're expecting other witnesses for Thursday afternoon. We also will submit the subcommittee report, which I'll allocate about 5 minutes for, and we have to go, I guess we have to go in camera on that one, don't we? It's not required. Not required, okay. Well, hopefully we will not have to go in camera, and then we don't have to do all that. And we've just got authorization to travel in November. So just start setting aside your calendars accordingly. So with that, meeting adjourned. Thank you.